Hi, and welcome to another Bible study. Today we are on Genesis 9, and this is a story, a chapter that's looking at God's covenant with all mankind, and then a very odd interaction between Noah and his sons that has a blessing but also a curse in it. And chapter 9 is attributed to the priestly tradition. So the P tradition as the writer, and a reminder, the P tradition is very concerned with how life is ordered, with how to order one's life so that it's more directly connected to God. It's meant as a writing to help in that survival of the correct way to live. And it also has the goal, because of the time period it's being written in, to help the Israelites in exile to deal with their insecurities and to respond to their loss of liberty. And so it's trying to provide a little bit of certainty about what is going on, is the priestly tradition. Priestly tradition, like I said, exile period. So we're looking at Babylonian exile between the 550 to 450 BCE in there, and maybe even a little bit after exile, which will kind of make sense as we go through this chapter. So some interesting things to note. First, 17 verses, that life on earth is essentially beginning again after the flood, and there are new rules to living and working, and it's structured to prevent corrupting violence. Does it really? But it's being structured that. It's to have those rules to help us live together more peacefully. And in those first 17 chapters, we get 3 speeches. And the first speech is where God announces a new state of affairs within the created order. The relationship between humans and animals has changed. Now the animals will dread humans, and humans will now kill animals as sources of food. It seems that if we're reading through the previous 8 chapters, that humans weren't necessarily carnivores. And so something just kind of interesting about, all right, here's something about what changes after the flood. And that in this, there is the prohibition that you are to drain the blood of an animal before eating. And this seems to be about that blood is connected to life, and that the whole thing about you are not to consume the life force of an animal, that humankind has the right to nourishment, but not to life. So, hence, the blood, the symbol of life, must be drained and returned to God. Verse 5, we get, if people kill each other, they will have a difficult time propagating and filling the earth. So there's this, hey, don't kill each other, and this is going to cause real issues, right? We even talk about this once we get to the 10 Commandments in much later Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and of looking at how our relationships, what helps relationships and what destroys relationships. And so here we recognize that humans killing one another destroys relationships, and that it also prevents from repopulating the earth after the flood. And it also is talking about, to cause the death of a human constitutes an offense against God, who has created that person, because all of us are created in the image of God. When we get through to verses 8 through 17, this is the second and another speech, verses 8 through 11. It initiates a new topic of covenant, and the Noah covenant. God takes on the obligation of preserving life for both humans and animals, and the covenant is really kind of the means of a divine oath. With verse 16, it's the third speech, which highlights the sign of the covenant. All the covenants from here on out will have a sign. Abraham, it'll be circumcision. With Moses, it will be the Sabbath. And so the sign of the covenant constitutes God saying, all right, I recognize the sign of the rainbow in the skies, it has a few meanings to it. One is that in the area, the I can never say this correctly, iconography of a god or king with a bow. So the ruling class are often seen with a bow, and that would have been well known throughout the Near East. And God is saying, this bow is now about peace instead of war. So saying there will be no more destruction. It's also stretched between heaven and earth, and that it's like bringing peace between the two realms, right? So when we see a rainbow in the sky, it stretches from earth into the sky and back to earth. And so it's bringing the two together. And so it's a sign of mutuality and coexistence of God and creation. And it'll be hinted at with this of being this moment of between the heavens and divine protection on the curve of the dome of heaven. And we will read in other places throughout the biblical text of the bow. When we get to verses 18 through 29, it marks a transition in the book of Genesis. Flood story is now over. Creation, it has its new rules, the new covenant, the new oath has been taken by God, and what God will now do for humanity and what God asked humanity to do. And now we move into, all right, the people business of, all right, here's Noah. And so new realities emerge. With verse 20, we get to the whole thing. Remember the ground being cursed we found with Adam, and that Adam is cursed and the ground is going to be hard to till. And so we get the production of wine, which provides comfort. But what the ground now produces is providing some comfort, but it's also complex because it also causes problems, because wine can cause drunkenness. And so we see that with this story of Noah. He becomes a vintner and he's cultivating wine, but then he gets drunk, and there are consequences for being drunk. And it says in the story that Shem saw his father Noah uncovered. And it's important to know that that is a euphemism for engaging in sexual intercourse. And so it is believed that Ham walked in on his parents, and Ham walks out and he goes and tells his brothers, Shem and Japheth, what has happened. And Shem and Japheth actually walk backwards into the tent with a blanket and covers up Noah and presumably their mother. And it's important to note that Shem and Japheth try not to shame their father. And so the problem seems to be that Ham is shaming by seeing and then talking about it. That he shouldn't have seen, it was inappropriate, but now he's like talking about it, which provides an imbalance of power, that now Ham is the man, that Ham now has the power over his father. So it's kind of interesting just the way that part of the story unfolds, because when we're reading it, it just sounds like, wait a minute, Noah's at fault. He's the one that's drunk. So why does him get blamed? But in the context of this particular story, it seems to be about shame and how Ham is shaming his father. And so to even recognize that of when we see somebody else in precarious situations of, do we shame them or not? How do we handle those situations? And then we have Noah giving the speech in verses 25 through 27, and Noah blesses and then he curses. And so this is kind of an interesting moment, because Noah curses not Ham, but Canaan. And that's kind of interesting, right? So cursing a future. And it's important to note that in this particular passage, it is a person, but then it becomes a people, the Canaanite people. And at first you're like, okay, so is this about them not intermarrying? But then we get instances where like Isaac's allowed to marry the Canaanites, Jacob's allowed to marry the Canaanites, Judah does marry a Canaanite. So that's like in Genesis 24, Genesis 28, and Genesis 38. And so what we have to understand is Canaan it's made up of multiple ethnic identities, and it could be identified with certain boundaries, which are associated with cities and coastal towns. But the real problem is, all right, how is it's symbolizing anybody who threatens Israel. So if we're thinking about when this is written, we are thinking about, all right, they are in exile in Babylon, and they're hoping to go back to their homeland, which they do. But then they get back there and there's issues about intermarriage, and should you marry the people that are not Israelites? So that's kind of an interesting moment. Also, the J narrative may have listed Noah's sons as Shem, Japheth, and Canaan, while the P source, most definitely, it's Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Japheth being the middle child for J and the youngest for P. So it's interesting that even how the J source kind of switches up things from the P source. But just to recognize that there's a little bit of discrepancy in this, and that as we're thinking about, we get so focused upon the curse on Canaan that we may miss that actually even in verse 27 suggests that Japheth and Shem do not receive identical blessings. That the notion of living in someone else's tents more literally means that one party disposes another. And so we have a little bit of problem going in there. What's even more interesting about that is Japheth is, it seems, a little bit over Shem, even though Shem is supposed to end up being the father of the Israelites. And it's kind of one of those moments where we're like, all right, this is a problematic passage. It's kind of hard to understand, but we also need to understand how it's been misused. And this particular part of the passage has absolutely been misused with concerning the curse of Ham. In fact, it played a crucial role in American history by providing biblical justification for both slavery and segregation. And no biblical story has been so consistently used as a proof text for the enslavement and oppression of those from African descent, which is highly problematic. And you may be reading it going, it's been used for what? To recognize that there are times where people will use scripture to harm, yet there is no indication that we are supposed to use scripture to harm others. But that when somebody wants to harm somebody else, they try to use justification, and so they will go to the biblical text. And so that's just something to be very aware of how it has been used inappropriately in the past to justify actions that are not biblical or that are mentioned, but not anything that has to do with being Christ-like. So if we're wondering about what does it mean to be Christ-like, well, that's all about healing and love and has nothing to do with hurting other people. And so that's just kind of important to keep in. And even Jesus is quoting out of Leviticus when he's like, you are supposed to love God and love your neighbor. Like that's all the law and the prophets. That's all it boils down to. Love God and love neighbor. And so there are moments where we come across these pieces of passages where they have not been used in a place of love. But if we keep that lens on it of going, all right, what is this trying to tell us? What is this trying to mean? What we're looking at here is the text is trying to convey a few things. One is that the blessing in Genesis 9 is God's beneficent action, which continues from the time of creation. Now God reaffirms the blessing of humans by blessing the flood survivors and his sons. In verses 20 through 29, the purpose of this biblical story is not to espouse moderation in drinking, but to relate what occurs after Noah gets drunk. Like, hey, you need to pay attention to what happens. Another thing that the passage is trying to convey is that although it's ambiguous as to what Ham engaged in, he asserted his power over. His father was in a vulnerable position, and Ham asserted power over and shamed his father. So Ham did not cause Noah to drink too much and to be drunk, but then he continues on with shaming him. So the relationship is then broken. Another thing that the passage is trying to convey is that not only does Ham personally shame, but now Ham tries to shame publicly with telling his brother. So it's like, can't even stop on the individual level, but now is trying to shame him out in the public. So one of the things about Shem and Japheth covering their father Noah is it's trying to convey that they covered his shame, that they helped him out of a bad situation, that even though they didn't cause the situation, they still tried to help him. So it's just kind of an interesting thing of different things the passage is trying to convey in ways that are somewhat a little bit removed from us, and we're like, that sounds kind of crazy, or I don't understand, because that's not necessarily our culture. However, we do understand things like relationships and what breaks relationships, and how do we engage with people in when they are vulnerable or when we are vulnerable. Is there shame present? Is there not? How do we make sure we are going about it in a way that's about bringing people together as opposed to dividing out and harming one another? So the purpose of this, you can think of this in three things of why does this matter to us, is one, of trying to make sense of relationships between humans, groups of people, and all of creation after the flood. How do we care for one another? How do we treat each other with respect and dignity? Do we shame each other? Do we harm our relationships? And then it's also trying to convey and help us why, like, it matters today because of thinking about the relationship between God and all of creation going forth. If God loves all of creation, and if God is creating everything new, even after the flood story, of how are we part of that new creation? How are we part of cultivating that creation instead of harming that creation? And then also it is trying to convey and make us think about the consequences, right? Noah has consequences. Ham has consequences from shaming his father. Noah has the consequences of being drunk. And to think about that and to recognize there are consequences for our actions, and how do we deal with those moments, and do we consider the consequences of our actions before we take action? So just some things to consider, some helpful things about why it matters for us today. I hope that this was helpful as you read through it. And now I'm going to take a little bit of time to read Genesis 9. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fertile, multiply, and fill the earth. All of the animals on the earth will fear you and dread you, all the birds in the sky, everything crawling on the ground, and all of the sea's fish. They are in your power. Everything that lives and moves will be your food. Just as I gave you the green grasses, I now give you everything. However, you must not eat meat with its life, its blood in it. I will surely demand your blood for a human life. From every living thing, I will demand it. From humans, from a man for his brother, I will demand something for a human life. Whoever sheds human blood by a human, his blood will be shed. For in the divine image, God made human beings. As for you, be fertile and multiply, populate the earth and multiply in it. God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I am now setting up my covenant with you, with your descendants, and with every living being with you, with the birds, with the large animals, and with all the animals of the earth, leaving the ark with you. I will set up my covenant with you so that never again will all life be cut off by flood waters. There will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the symbol of the covenant that I am drawing up between me and you and every living thing with you on behalf of every future generation. I have placed my bow in the clouds. It will be the symbol of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember the covenant between me and you and every living being among all the creatures. Flood waters will never again destroy all creatures. The bow will be in the clouds, and upon seeing it, I will remember the enduring covenant between God and every living being of all the earth's creatures. God said to Noah, this is the symbol of the covenant that I have set up between me and all the creatures on earth. Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, came out of the ark. Now Ham was Canaan's father. These were Noah's 3 sons, and from them the whole earth was populated. Noah, a farmer, made a new start and planted a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and took off his clothes in his tent. Ham, Canaan's father, saw his father naked and told his 2 brothers who were outside. Shem and Japheth took a robe, threw it over his shoulders, walked backwards, and covered their naked father without looking at him because they turned away. When Noah woke up from his wine, he discovered what his youngest son had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest servant. He will be for his brothers." He also said, "Bless the Lord, the God of Shem. Canaan will be his servant. May God give space to Japheth. He will live in Shem's tents, and Canaan will be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. In all, Noah lived 950 years. Then he died. May your day be blessed.